King Farouk's second wife, Queen Nariman, finally gave him the son he longed for, and then his life unravelled before his eyes. After ignoring his kingdom for years, Farouk was ousted from his throne just months after the birth of his heir. The royal couple lost almost everything in the blink of an eye, but fate had another twist in store for them. When Farouk was born on February 11th, 1920, it was into unimaginable wealth. The first son and eldest child of King Fuad I of Egypt and Nazli Sabri, the boy was already a celebrated heir from the moment he was born, and called the plush Abdin Palace in Cairo his home. At the time, Egypt was still very much a male-dominated, patriarchal society, but even by these standards, Farouk's family dynamic was disturbing. His father, King Fuad, demanded total control over his mother, Nazli, even confining her to the palace. Farouk was only permitted to see his mother for an hour each day, and he wasn't allowed to leave the palace grounds. He didn't even see the Great Pyramids until he was an adult, despite growing up right beside them. And to say Farouk was incredibly spoiled doesn't even begin to cover it. For one, he was the only boy among 4 sisters, which meant he was the centre of attention at all times, and it was a totally normal thing for servants to greet him by kissing the ground and then his hand. Yet, even the golden child Farouk had a fatal flaw. As the little master of the house, Farouk grew up knowing he would one day rule all of Egypt. But one day, his advisors noticed a serious issue. The young prince wasn't just bad at his school studies, he was downright dismal. In addition to Farouk's total disinterest in learning, he also became a notorious practical joker, and his pranks were more infuriating than funny. One day he asked a visiting Queen Marie of Romania if she wanted to see the royal horses. When she innocently said yes, he released the steeds into his father's harem, where they promptly pooped all over the floor. Okay, that's actually pretty funny. When he was a teenager, Farouk's behaviour caught up to him in a big way. His family wanted him to get into the prestigious Eton College in England, and although Farouk got the best tutors, the prince didn't spend his prep time studying. Instead, he gallivanted around London with the Prince of Wales, attending football matches in the day and brothels at night. Farouk may have had a decadent youth, but no one deserves the tragedy that came for him next. In 1936, when he was just 16 years old, his father, King Fuad, suffered a fatal heart attack. Suddenly, the teenager was the king of all Egypt, with an enormous burden on his shoulders. When he returned home to Egypt, immense crowds greeted him in Alexandria and proclaimed him the beloved king. However, it would all start to unravel in a matter of months. Although the people of Egypt might have been optimistic about their bright young king, all was not well behind the palace doors. Not only did everyone on the inside know that Farouk was green and petulant, but Farouk's cousin Prince Muhammad Ali was next in line for the throne, and immediately started plotting to overthrow him. From the moment he became king, Farouk threw himself into royal life with an abandon his previous debauchery had only hinted at. While many of Egypt's citizens starved, Farouk reportedly ate 600 oysters a week. He also bought a red Bentley, then demanded that no one else paint their own cars red. Obviously, Farouk loved ostentatious displays of his charmed life, but he also loved shows of brutal force. He infamously kept an armed guard of 30 Albanians around him at all times. These bodyguards were an unmistakable warning not to cross him, but people still tried. When Farouk first took the throne, his advisors tried to push him into a pro-British stance. The Brits were, after all, occupying the country, but the king staunchly refused. His father was a known Italophile, and Farouk also became obsessed with Italy and Benito Mussolini. He even fired all of his British servants and replaced them with Italians. On August 24th, 1937, the country rejoiced when King Farouk announced his engagement to Safanaz Zulfikar, a beautiful commoner who was the daughter of a humble judge. Farouk might have been a spoiled brat, but he was a smart spoiled brat. When it came time for him to choose a bride, Farouk and his mother, the Dowager Queen Nazli, had shrewdly proposed marriage to a commoner to boost the extravagant king's declining popularity with regular Egyptian workers. When Safanaz first received Farouk's attention, she was only 15 years old, and that's exactly how he planned it. After all, he and his mother wanted the future queen to be pliable and naive. Safanav's father angrily protested at first, forcing Farouk to pay him off with the princely title of Pasha to shut him up. When Farouk started courting his bride-to-be, it must have all seemed glamorous to the young girl. Her Prince Charming arrived at her 16th birthday party in an Alfa Romeo before getting down on one knee in front of all her guests. He even gave her a new name, Farida, since he believed F names were lucky. Time would prove that very wrong. King Farouk was used to the plush side of life, but that didn't mean he was a sophisticated man. On the contrary, one of his many mistresses, Irene Ginley, revealed just how coarse the ruler could be. She said, "Farouk never wrote a letter, never read a paper, never listened to music. His idea of culture was movies." Hey, what's wrong with movies? On January 20th, 1938, King Farouk married Queen Farida at Quba Palace in Cairo, in a lavish royal ceremony done up to every single one of Farouk's gaudy tastes. As was her duty, the teenage queen got pregnant almost immediately. Farida gave birth to a healthy child, and Farouk became a father at 18. But that child was a girl. Farouk was deeply, devastatingly disappointed in his newborn daughter, whom he named Princess Farial. And although the king consoled himself that he and Queen Farida had plenty of time to make a son, he also knew his cousin Prince Muhammad Ali was still at his back and after his crown. By late 1939, Queen Farida was pregnant again, and in April 1940 she gave birth to a girl again. This time, King Farouk was infuriated not only with his queen, but with himself. Many people in Egypt believed that if a man couldn't sire a boy, it said bad things about his masculinity. After consulting with doctors about his condition, he began eating certain foods to increase his virility. Farouk became so obsessed with eating manly man foods, he developed bulimia, going on binges and purging himself afterward, gaining a huge amount of weight. And did it work? No. With her husband driving himself mad in his succession obsession, Queen Farida might have struck up an affair with the Egyptian aristocrat Wahid Yusri. It's safe to say that King Farouk was having a very bad year in 1940, but it was about to get apocalyptic. On top of everything else, Farouk also found out that his widowed mother was having a full-blown dalliance with his old tutor, Prince Ahmed Hassanin. The king dealt with the situation with level-headed grace and rationality. Just kidding. When he found the two lovers reading the Quran to each other in the bedroom, he pulled out a gun and proclaimed that since they were disgracing his father's memory, God would forgive him for killing one of them. He managed to control himself this time, but soon his bad decisions were all over the world stage. By the 1940s, King Farouk was caught in the middle of World War politics. Egypt was neutral, but his ministers were very concerned about his pro-Italian and pro-German tendencies. They forced him to break ties with those countries, but Farouk still privately backed the Axis powers, aka Team Evil. Farouk's appreciation for decadence was notorious throughout Egypt, but few people knew his worst secret. Believe it or not, the Supreme King of Egypt was also a kleptomaniac. In August 1942, King Farouk met with the famously cantankerous British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In the meeting, King Farouk pilfered the Prime Minister's gold watch. Only Farouk must not have been as good a thief as he thought he was, because the quick-witted Churchill knew immediately that he'd been swindled, and Farouk had to claim he'd only done it as a practical joke. King Farouk and Queen Farida had been living in misery ever since the birth of their second daughter, and Farouk soon made a grim discovery. He found out, for certain this time, that his wife was having an affair, this time with the debonair British painter Simon Elwes. The king became so infuriated, Elwes had to flee the country, but the hits just kept on coming. Queen Farida was pregnant, and the timing was as suspicious to Farouk as it was to everyone else. On December 15th, 1943, Queen Farida gave birth to yet another daughter, Princess Fadia. From then on, their marriage was all but a sham, though Farouk had bigger problems to worry about. World War II wasn't good for the king. His popularity was hanging by a thread, and that's when his old enemies swooped in. His rival, British High Commissioner Miles Lampson, gave him an ultimatum. Accept a new government led by the WAFT, a political party that the king saw as his enemies, or abdicate. When Farouk refused to budge, Lampson stormed the king's property at Abdeen Palace with tanks and scores of armed men. Initially, Farouk had planned to kill Lampson, but his old tutor, Prince Hassanin, stepped in and calmed the king down. Indeed, he somehow convinced the hot-headed ruler to accept the new government in exchange for keeping the power and wealth he loved so dearly. It was an agreement that everyone came to regret. After emasculating himself in front of his rival, Lampson, Farouk desperately wanted to prove once more he was a virile strongman. He jumped full force into collecting beautiful women, even getting his valet to trawl the city looking for candidates. Around this time, Farouk earned the mystical-sounding nickname, the King of the Night. But this wasn't a compliment. The moniker stemmed from the copious amount of time he spent in Cairo nightclubs, very dignified. While that nonsense was going on, his kingdom was going to ruin. He continued to alienate his government, trying to dismiss prime ministers left, right and centre, and generally treated his own people with disdain. Farouk and Queen Farida stayed together for 3 more hollow years after the birth of their third daughter, but by November 1948 they were done for good, and Farouk officially announced the divorce. In response to Egypt's civil unrest, the 28-year-old king decided he would just marry again. He figured a royal wedding and a new queen would distract the people from all of his shortcomings. Although his specifications for a new fiancée included some more reasonable details, like she had to be of Egyptian ancestry, he also bizarrely insisted she be an only child and, most disturbingly, 16 years old. Despite his extremely specific wish list, his advisors managed to find him everything he was looking for in Nariman Sadek, an upper middle class girl who could take on the responsibility of being a baby-making machine. When word got out that Farouk was interested, people started calling Nariman the Cinderella of the Nile. Yet, like all fairy tales, this one had a darker side too. For all that Nariman seemed like the perfect pick for a bride, there was a huge problem no one could ignore. She was already engaged. Her current fiancé, a PhD candidate in economics at Harvard, was no slouch, but he was no match for King Farouk either. In a familiar move, the ruler simply granted Nariman's father a title, and voila. While tensions continued to rise in his kingdom, Farouk and his boys ate, drank, and flew planes all around France on a very public bender for 2 whole months. Upon his return to Egypt, he found a letter on his desk from his opposition in Parliament. Its contents made his blood run cold. In the message, he was warned that a revolt was near. When he married Queen Nariman in 1951, the royal couple took another months-long vacation, honeymooning around Europe. To add insult to injury, reporters spotted Farouk eating gargantuan helpings of food during Ramadan. Despite that, Apparently the couple did something right on their honeymoon, because by the middle of 1951 the Queen was pregnant, and on January 16th, 1952, Farouk's dreams came true when his new bride gave birth to a son, at last, the Crown Prince Fuad. The king was beyond excited, so it was too bad that everything came tumbling down within days. On January 25th, less than a week after the birth of his son, tensions erupted when British officers clashed with Egyptian auxiliary forces. The conflict sparked into a literal fire the next day, and Egyptian rioters razed a huge chunk of downtown Cairo to the ground in protest of the British occupation of Egypt. Farouk was busy giving his son a fancy birth luncheon at Abdeen Palace when the protests broke out. He only noticed something was amiss when he looked away from his 600 guests and saw ominous black smoke rising from downtown. In the aftermath of this so-called Black Saturday, the people of Egypt still wanted to give King Farouk a chance. They just needed him to do one thing: take a firm stance and kick the British out of Egypt. Yet, despite his lifelong hatred of the Brits, he didn't. His new son, his new wife, and his old bad habits proved to be too much of a distraction. Suddenly, all the remaining goodwill toward the King of Egypt evaporated, and his fate was sealed. In the heat of an Egyptian summer on July 23, 1952, the pro-independence faction, the Free Officers, had enough of their distant king. They staged a military coup and took control of Cairo, kickstarting nothing less than the Egyptian Revolution in the process. When King Farouk heard of the coup in Cairo, he dealt with the crisis in a level-headed, rational manner. Just kidding, he absolutely lost his mind. The King of Egypt grabbed a machine gun and hunkered down in his palace with hundreds of men from his personal guard. Then, when the Free Officers came for him on the 25th of July, he tried to shoot them off one by one, killing 4 men. On the morning of the 26th, the Free Officers brought their tanks and artillery to Alexandria, and Farouk knew the jig was up. He arranged a ceasefire, then allowed the men to state their terms. He could either abdicate, or they would storm the palace and execute him. Like Farouk himself, this was a no-brainer, and he signed the abdication papers that day in front of a Supreme Court justice, then fled to Italy. Less than a year later, Egypt formally abolished the monarchy, ending the 150-year rule of Farouk's family in the blink of an eye. Fed up with his infidelity and without a crown to keep her there anymore, Nariman left Farouk just a few months after Egypt abolished the monarchy. After all, this was not what she signed up for. In 1953, the middle-aged noble chose 18-year-old Irma Capechi Minutolo as his final official mistress, despite how outraged it made the teenage girl's parents. But just because Farouk's women made him feel young at heart didn't mean his heart was in good shape. In the end, King Farouk died young, collapsing at a restaurant in Rome in March 1965 at the age of just 45. To many on the outside, it seemed like his fast-living life had finally caught up to him. To others, however, his early end was far more suspicious than all that. Rumours still persist that Farouk didn't die of natural causes, and instead was targeted by Egyptian intelligence and poisoned. Perhaps most alarmingly, nobody ever performed an official autopsy on the former King of Egypt, which makes understanding his tragic, mysterious fate all the more difficult. Today, Farouk's legacy is tainted. The moment that Farouk abdicated, people began to pore through his personal belongings, and what they found shocked them. Although the kleptomaniac had masses of jewels and other trinkets, he also had a signed photograph of his old pal, Adolf Hitler. Oh, and it got worse. The most scandalous discovery amid all of Farouk's possessions made news all around the world. The king had a very, very extensive collection of adult paraphernalia, like one of the largest collections in the world. We're talking photos, calendars, watches, glasses. If you could put a picture of a woman's body on it, it was in his stash. The real tragedy here is that this guy never got to experience the internet. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.